Well, what happens when you are part of one of the most important scientific breakthroughs of your era, and that breakthrough causes the death of thousands and the suffering of thousands more? What happens when two people who are attracted to each other, despite coming from different worlds of family, money, and education and religion, but they're actually both Jewish, and yet they have all these differences? And what happens if both of those are happening at the same time in Los Alamos, New Mexico? Well, to find out, it's in the book, The Sound of a Thousand Stars by Rachel Robbins. Just a little bit of biographical background on Rachel. Rachel holds an MFA from the School of Art of the Art Institute of Chicago. She's a tenured assistant professor at Malcolm X College, part of the City Colleges of Chicago. She's a visual artist with paintings that have appeared on public transit, children's daycare centers, and the Magnificent Mile. She is the author, in addition to this book, of a poetic collection called In Lieu of Flowers. I first met Rachel about 10 years ago when she was engaged to Michael, the son of a longtime Hadash member. I had the chance to officiate at their wedding in Holland, Michigan. It was very hot that day, I remember. People ask me sometimes if my weddings are successful, and I tell them, yes, they all get married. But it's always nice to reconnect some years later and discover they are still married, and now with 2 children and a dog, and still living in Chicago. I was very interested to see the arrival of Rachel's first novel, and I was intrigued to discover that it was not just a novel about a love story set during the Manhattan Project, which is interesting in itself. It was also a story about personal history, and a feminist story, and a story grappling with ethics and morals, and also a Jewish story as well. So I thought, Rachel, maybe to start, you could read a passage from the book, give us a flavor of the writing and the storytelling, and then tell us a little bit about how you came to tell this story.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here and for that beautiful introduction. And thank you, all of you. I have to admit, I was a bit nervous to come here tonight. I think because this is, my mother-in-law's beloved, amazing cohort, and she's not here for this, and she's been trying to get me to come for all these years. And I think I just had to find my way here on my own time. So sorry, Sharon. I wish you could be here for a hug.
We will run more services in the future.
Yeah, we'll definitely be back. But I think for this book, so the title is The Sound of a Thousand Stars, which is not the title that I wanted. So I'll start with that. So when you work in publishing, you very rarely, did you get to use your title? Was that the title you wanted?
No.
Really?
No.
What was your title?
Oh, we had several that they didn't like.
You're not gonna tell us.
I think I blanked it out because it was so bitter. No, it was fine, but they had a vision of what they wanted. It's part of a series of Jewish thought books, so they want the titles to have sort of comparable titles. So okay. We were constrained.
Yes. So my working title, which I thought was brilliant, was Enola spelled backwards, and that was a nod to the Enola Gay, right? And Paul Tibbets named the aircraft the Enola Gay after his mother, which I thought was very strange, being a new mom, 2 times now, new mom, still feels new each time. And I kind of went, what would I think if my child named, this weapon of mass destruction after me? Would that be a good thing, right? And then, of course, Enola spelled backwards is alone. And so I thought about that reflection in the water, and I was like, did he realize what he was doing with that name? And then his mother, Enola, was actually named for a literary figure. So she was named for Enola, or Her Fatal Mistake by Mary Young Rittenbaugh. And so it was this sort of ripple effect of literature becoming a person, becoming, this horrific part of history. And I, because of that, wanted much of the book to run in reverse chronologically. So I can speak to that a little later. But then my publisher was like, what else you got? People won't get it, So I came up with The Sound of a Thousand Stars, which I'd been holding close and thinking about, but it's a reference to, the thousand, first of all, that's my numeric grandfather who inspired the book. And he was, just the whole world was mathematics to him, the way he saw the world. And then it's also Fred Olivy's kind of famous quote on the evening news after Boxcar dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki was the light of 1,000 suns illuminated the cockpit. So I have a lot kind of dealing with numbers and math and this kind of history that very much is not my expertise. And so what I love about being an author is you get to learn and try on a different career for a while. So this is my attempt at being a scientist.
What is this?
Thank you. I'm going to read a little bit from the preface, from the prologue. So this is July 16th, 1945, and you guys will recognize that date as the date of the Trinity test. Alice Katz did not exist. She was a rumor holding a stopwatch. In 12 seconds, she would be lost to all of history, swallowed up by New Mexico. T-minus 12, T-minus 11, T-minus 10. She heard Sam Allison's familiar voice counting down. She surveyed the network of crisscrossed wires entangling her in the cottage, an elaborate spider web. She fidgeted with the Geiger counter on the windowsill and adjusted the dial on the shortwave radio, trying to tune away the static. Alice had passed the witchy hours while New Mexico slept, studying the storm through the window, trying to see the empty desert through sheets of rainwater. When the night sky quieted, residual raindrops rolled slowly down the window pane, and her mind recited theories of cohesion and adhesion as she watched the water molecules interact. Water is attracted to water, she mumbled. Water is attracted to other substances. She thought about how in outer space, raindrops would be perfectly round spheres, but here on Earth, gravity weighed down the shapes into teardrops. Here on Earth, she thought, that phrase might mean something very different soon. T-minus 9, T-minus 8, T-minus 7. Sam counted through the radio. Alice felt like some mythological beast with two beating hearts. The fetus was already the size of a laboratory beaker, and it was growing. She had heard once somewhere that pregnant mothers were at once one and also two. T-minus 6, T-minus 5. The radio stuttered into white noise. She braced, knowing that in a matter of seconds, either a second sun would rise on the horizon, or it would be the end of the world. At the edges of her vision, she noticed that the trees were shining gold. Should I do one more or stop at that time-wise?
Well, I was interested, and when you read that again, I heard something I missed the first time through. And I know it's part of the plot later, but I didn't know it at the time, that there's this juxtaposition of life and death, where she's pregnant and she's expecting new life, but she's also been the author or the part author of this this possibility, as you say, to destroy the entire world. They didn't know if it would ignite the whole atmosphere and kill everything on the planet, or just have a limited impact. And I thought that was just a very well juxtaposed contrast between the life-giving and the death, and what she felt about herself in that role. And then the other variable is, it's not just an impersonal voice counting down. You know, normally you don't know who the countdown person is. For her, it's Sam, because she works there. She knows everybody. And so it's the intimacy and the personality there that really comes out.
Yeah, and I'll say too, so this story, we'll talk more about kind of the story behind the story in a bit, but this story is very much derived from my grandparents. My grandfather was the physicist, though, not my grandmother. But my grandmother actually wrote a book about her experience in Los Alamos called Los Alamos Experience, you know, very clear title. She didn't have any debate there. But it was her letters that she wrote home. And it was fascinating because she never really spoke about it with us, the grandchildren. I think there was a little bit of that, like, you protect your kids thing going on. And then we were afraid to ask. And it wasn't until, you know, working on the book and talking through interviews and speaking with people that I've, you know, my mom's actually the one who said, you know, maybe we never asked them. And I kind of wish now that I could, but anyways, she inspired this strong female character, even though she wasn't a physicist by trade. She was a social worker her whole life, but there were amazing women in STEM in Los Alamos. And as I'm sure you are aware, you get, you know, good reads and positive and negative, right? At least people are reading your book. And one review that really bothered me is someone said, this is ridiculous. There were no women in that, you know, that's wrong. And I was like, no, this is why this book needs to exist, because there were many women and women scientists and, you know, working as computers and behind the scenes. And so I wanted to tell the story of those women, one of whom I absolutely adore. Her name was Norma Gross. And when I worked with the Historical Society, I learned that she was inaccurately recorded in history and only recently corrected as Norman Gross, because they presumed that she was male. And so I wanted the women in STEM angle. But then, of course, the baby, you know, I was pregnant. My grandmother actually had a baby on the project. And so it was just kind of there.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So, yeah, why don't you share another passage here?
Okay. All right, I'm going to read a section. So there's a character in the story where the storyline goes in reverse. And it's Haruki Sato, who is a hibakusha, which is a word that was invented in Japanese to describe the survivors of the atomic bomb, because a new word was needed to describe these people who, were doomed to live out the rest of their lives on borrowed time. And his storyline goes in reverse throughout the book. And I almost pulled it, actually, from the book when I was going through edits. And then I really felt strongly that it needed to be in the book, especially as Oppenheimer, the movie, was making the rounds and there was not a single Japanese person featured in the film, right? And so I felt like the story needed to be included. So this is Haruki, and it's very closely based on a true hibakusha named Tsuneo Tsuboi, who I'd love to speak about more after we read it. So Haruki could feel the heat of the doctor's stare. You may want to contact a minister about last rites, he said, eyeing Haruki quizzically as he awaited a response. The doctor was young and sharply dressed with a fresh haircut. He had his whole life before him. Usually, when I tell someone they're dying, they have a few questions. I've been told I was terminal 3 times, muttered Haruki. What I'm saying is it's a good idea to get your affairs in order. It's time to make final arrangements. Gather a last will and testament, power of attorney. Although he sat perfectly still on the crinkly brown hospital paper, Haruki had the sensation of wind running through his hair. He imagined himself on the hill of glowing purple azaleas where he had buried Shinju. They had come there to die once before. Death can be a burden on the living, the doctor was saying. But Haruki wasn't listening. He was distracted by the smell of salt in the air. In his mind's eye, he could make out the red spires of the Ando Bridge. Shinju's final resting place overlooked Ando no Seto in the Seto Inland Sea, which connects the main island of Japan and Kurahashi Island. It was a tourist trap down there in the hustle and bustle of honking taxis and drifting ferries, but from so high up, he was alone with the wind. He could see the whole strait. The spring flowers had bloomed in fallen clouds of pink and purple. He realized the doctor was waiting for him to say something. I died on August 6, 1945, he said. I may have left Hiroshima, but I will never leave Hiroshima. He might have still been breathing, but he was already buried beside her.
I'm curious about your choice to include the Japanese perspective. I mean, not only as a corrective to Oppenheimer not doing that, and I wonder how many people watching it noticed that there weren't any Japanese characters. It's like when you have, movies without women in leading roles, and men who watch it say, "What? There weren't any women in?" They don't even notice. So that may be part of the problem with Oppenheimer too. But you chose to do this in a very prominent way, and you also chose to do it going backwards instead of sort of building up the same way. I'm curious both about the choice to do that, but also what were some of the challenges you ran into in trying to conceive that and integrate it and also, provide a voice to this population that is different.
Yeah, so that was a really hard decision. It's a really important question because as a English professor, I spent a lot of time talking about appropriation in my classroom, right? And worrying about who can tell what story. It's great fodder for discussion with students, but the stakes are higher when you're publishing a book with your name attached to it. And I was like, I really can't be, I felt that I could tell the Jewish story. Like I could do that on both sides of the family, the disagreements, the fiddler on the roof thing that's happening in their family. I could talk about that all day, but I didn't know that I could tell this story. And so in kind of final editing stages, I'd had a conversation. A couple of my author friends read the book and said, maybe pull it. I don't know if you need it. And so I reached out for a sensitivity read to a friend of mine who I'd lost touch with. Her name is Rumi Okazaki. We grew up together. She had moved to the Bay Area where I grew up, not speaking a word of English, and we just chased each other around on the playground. And then she moved back to Tokyo in high school and just disappeared, and we lost touch. It was my best friend for all these years. And then I asked her to read, and we went back and forth about the book a bunch, and she helped me make sure that the ceremonies were correct and things were, represented in a way that felt authentic. And then she said, I never knew that your grandfather worked on the bomb. And my grandfather lived in Hiroshima. And he got sent away the week of the bombing on business. And so he lived, and therefore my whole family line exists today. And, we had never discussed it. We'd been friends our whole lives. And so I think that's when I was like, this needs to be in the book because, as a mom and I look at my daughter, I want these conversations to happen. It's so easy to avoid them or to just skim over the hard parts. And so I really wanted that. And then I'll also say Tsuneo Tsuboi, who this is based on, passed away 3 years ago. And he was the co-chair of the Nihon Hidenkyo, which is the organization of Hibakusha stories that just won the Nobel Peace Prize. And this was big news. You know, a lot has happened since then, but no one even remembers now. But this was big news at the time. And you know, it was this kind of nod to the importance of collecting survivor stories. But I also, and I've written about this for the Jewish Book Council, like I think it was a little bit too little too late that Suneo Siboyi didn't live long enough to see this recognition of his life's work in the form of the Nobel Prize, and that most Hibakusha, you know, just like Holocaust survivors, are passing away. And so the importance of sharing those stories, recording them, I just really wanted that story in the book.
Yeah. So I'm interested in the story. You did feel confident in telling the Jewish angle story.
But less confident talking out loud in synagogue about, perhaps.
We are not a non-judgmental synagogue. So you have two main characters in the book that come from these differing Jewish experiences. You've got Alice from an upper class, more assimilated, less religious Jewish family, and Caleb, who comes from a poorer Jewish family, but also much more religious. He himself has sort of left the beliefs behind, but some of the practices are harder to, you know, you can take the kid out of the synagogue, but it's hard to take the synagogue out of the kid. Because he goes to college, he starts studying physics, and his faith sort of withers if it hadn't withered before. But he still has this programming of kosher dietary laws and which prayers to recite at certain times and so on, where Alice is coming from a totally different, also Jewish, but a totally different Jewish experience. And I'm not going to ask you what percent they resemble your actual grandparents. But what I am curious about is, you know, I mean, you didn't have to make the characters Jewish necessarily. That was something you chose to do. And when we were talking about the book, even early on, you said there were certain Jewish dynamics and identities and conflicts that you wanted to explore in this book. And one thing I found particularly authentic was you even included a representative of the Jewish socialist left from the International Workers' Order, which were actually communists. They called themselves left, but they were left of left. And he's also in the book, but he's clearly Jewish. And it even says in the book, no matter what he did, he was speaking with a Yiddish accent, and you could tell, everyone could tell that this character was Jewish. So I'm curious for your choice to work the Jewish into it, and also how you went about doing that.
Okay, well, I have no problem with sharing how much this is nonfiction, although my dad is listening. So, so I think very much so the communist, that's Ben Peterson, love him to pieces. He was my grandfather's best friend. One of the most amazing parts of researching for this book is that I interviewed people after my grandfather passed away, and I felt like I had maybe more permission to write the story. I don't know that I would have written it while he was still alive. I started interviewing people he had known and loved, and that brought me into contact with Ben Peterson, who passed away in the time between when I interviewed him and when the book came out. And he was hilarious. I just loved him. I can see why my grandpa loved him. He was an SED, so special engineer detachment. So he was a physicist guy, undergraduate, you know, who got pulled into the army because he had some specialized knowledge, but not a ton, and didn't want to be in the army. So he never made his sheets. He slept on top of them because he didn't want to make his bed in the military. And they stole mechanical parts all the time from the tech area and listened to music. They built a record player and listened to music in the back lab areas in the middle of the night. They call themselves the Mushroom Society because mushrooms grow at night. So I just loved Ben. He was wonderful. And I was so sad when he passed away. And so thankful that this brought me into connection with him. The other parts of it are very much, and I have written this also, Jewish Book Council, but this idea that I grew up watching, okay, so I'll go further back. So my grandmother lost contact with her family because they didn't support her education. She was from an Orthodox family, and they gave the kind of funds and future and idea for who should get the education to her brother. And then my father, sorry, Dad, married my mom. So my grandmother went on to be a Hebrew teacher at a conservative synagogue. And then my dad married my mom, who had grown up so reformed that she didn't know any Hebrew, you know, had a Christmas tree. And then my mom always hid the clam chowder, right, when my grandma came to visit. I always saw that. And then when we got married, and you were so helpful in these moments, my mom didn't want pork served at the wedding. But why? Why is that the thing? And so I think it was just this sort of watering down of following which traditions you choose that I was like, you know, which is why I think your book has been meaning so much to me lately. There's this line that I keep getting stuck on that you said, I don't know if you were quoting from someone else, but you said that it seems more Jewish to laugh than to pray.
Mhm.
And I loved that. And I was like, yeah, you know, that's the thing, because clearly my Jewish identity means a lot to me, but I'm sort of a runaway. Like, I haven't wanted to observe, but I think about it constantly. And I couldn't write a book any other way. I didn't set out to write a Jewish book. I just wrote, and it was a Jewish book.
Yeah, I will say that's a Sherwin Wine quote, that I always thought laughing was more Jewish than praying. Yeah, it's very nice. One of the things I did find interesting in the book also is, you know, when you're reading a novel that has a lot of Jewish content to it, sometimes you have to explain what it is. So if you just say they went to a Shiva house, well, a general reading audience isn't necessarily going to know what that is, or the kosher dietary laws, or those kind of things. Was that something that you felt you had to sort of go back and clarify, or an editor pointed out, you know, you need to explain this, or did it sort of flow naturally as you were telling the story to drop in a clause here or there to clarify, and then it was smooth?
Yeah, I don't know how much I explained and how much it just was kind of in the ethos of the moment. I was, you know, certainly aware. Okay, so I was thinking about one thing, which is that often when you read, and I talk about this with code switching in my classroom a lot, when you read something and then there's this need to explain it, there's often like a following within a positive phrase, right? And I didn't want to do that. I'd rather have someone miss a detail and understand the emotional tenor of the moment than understand every single detail, right? And so I was thinking a lot. So I teach art as well as English. And there's this idea in art of you're either painting a window into another world that someone could get, you know, transfer through and get lost in, or you're painting a surface, right? So that you know that you can't go through. And I think in trying to over-explain all those details and create a window, you would actually create a surface, keep them out of the emotional element of the story. And so I wanted that window, even if we lost a little bit in the translation.
Sure. I did also like occasionally you have these sort of secret in jokes. And my favorite was you mentioned this character, David Greenglass, and you say, I never thought of David Greenglass as a gossip. Now, for those who don't know, and my guess is nobody here knows who David Greenglass is, maybe one person does. David Greenglass had a very famous sister whose name was Ethel. And Ethel married a man named Julius, whose last name was Rosenberg. So David Greenglass was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's brother-in-law, and he turned state's witness against them and testified against them at the Rosenberg trial. He saved himself and his wife at the expense of his sister and his brother-in-law. You know, the issue of communists at Los Alamos and the whole atomic spying issue. There's some reference to communists involved there at times, but I laughed out loud at that one because, you know, 6 people are going to get it, but but it's one of those true to life details in the story where David Greenglass was there, and it turns out he was a bit of a gossip because he gave all these secrets to his brother who sent him on to the Soviets.
Yeah, you're the first person who has caught that. That's the first interview that someone has said that. And then also there's a second spy, Klaus Fuchs, is also in the book.
Oh,
And
yes.
I put that in there because they were really there, because Ben Peterson really did bunk next to David Greenglass and really did say he was a loudmouth. Like, we hated him. He was trying to get all these secrets out of us and we didn't tell him. And then he goes, well, I might have told him some things, you know, I can't remember. It was so many years ago. I was like, Ben Peterson, did you tell David Greenglass? But yeah, so that's absolutely because I wanted there to be these Easter eggs. Part of that is because this was a big project. Initially, I thought I was writing nonfiction. And so I probably deleted 1,000 pages in writing this. And I had the whole, you know, I tried to have the Rosenbergs and their amazing story, and Picasso speaking about it, and all this stuff that I wanted in there that, you know, you can only fit so much in the story.
Well, you could have written the Oppenheimer book and then have it be a doorstop instead. But you do have some living, like real life people in here. You know, that's the historical fiction part. Is there's some history and there's some fiction, and you got to choose which ones you're going to do. So I'm curious how you chose to highlight certain ones and not other ones. I mean, it's good you didn't choose to focus on Oppenheimer, because by the time this came out, that had been done, you know, in major Hollywood form. But you did spend a lot of time focused on Richard Feynman as one example, more so than Niels Bohr, who's more famous. You know, so how did you pick which historical figures you really wanted to have as active living characters in the novel?
So actually, a lot of that just came from who my grandparents really knew. I was working with archival documents, and I have my grandmother's letters home, and all of this kind of is pulled from their lived experience. I actually had, okay, and so again, agents and querying and the world of publishing, I had one rejection early on when it was nonfiction where someone said, well, no one wants to hear a story that's famous adjacent, was the way they put it. We only want to hear Oppenheimer's story. And I went, no, everybody wants to hear the, like, tell more stories, get at diverse angles into things in history instead of just telling the same myth over and over again. But Richard Feynman is a really complicated one. You guys are all familiar probably because he's so famous and so polarizing. And so he was someone I got interested in because my grandfather hated him, like furious if you mentioned his name. My mom accidentally gave him one of his books for a birthday one year, and he, threw it in the pool, I think. And Richard Feynman, was in addition to being this genius behind the bomb, he also famously, very publicly solved the Challenger explosion. He was the face of Apple's Think Different campaign. And he also is kind of featured as a mythical character that's inspiring the characters in The Big Bang Theory, that syndicated TV show, right? It's really popular, kind of this cult of masculinity that really celebrates him. And so when my grandfather hated him, I immediately went out and got his books. I went, okay, because like rebellious teenager, what is this guy? And his books are really funny. They're really good. They're really charming. And I love some of what he's written about teaching. I refer to it in the classroom. Actually, when I do teacher trainings, I refer to it then because he talks about students regurgitating scientific jargon, but not recognizing light refracting through water when it's outside their window. That said, if he was around today, he would have been Me Too'd. He absolutely posed as an undergrad to sleep with his students. He had his own students meet him in strip clubs for office hours. He was cited for abuse by his wife, his ex-wife, and did a lot of really bad things. And so I tried in writing him as a young person to not be too scathing and keep in mind this idea of presentism, which is a term that I've been thinking about a lot with writing this book, is like, how do you not judge someone by today's ethical standards when you're writing about a historical figure, right? We all do it, whether you want to or not. So I was scathing in my historical notes. I wanted people to know who he was and not make excuses, but I also wanted to allow him to be, a 20-something, just caught up in a moment in the story. My grandfather would probably be very upset that he's featured so prominently.
Yeah, but he's also a sympathetic character because in real life and in the novel, his wife is dying and he has a loyalty and an emotional connection to her. In fact, I was reading just today that Oppenheimer got him to come to Los Alamos because he found a sanatorium close by that he could send her to so he could see her periodically as opposed to not seeing her for 2 or 3 years while he was on the project. So there's a sympathetic side, but it is a complicated character. And I really did appreciate the historical notes you added at the end, including occasionally admitting when you had sort of pushed something back in time that wasn't actually in that chronological order. So there's a scene, I can give it away, I guess, where a Jewish woman is referred to as a Jap, standing for Jewish American Princess. It's a term that didn't come into currency until the 60s or 70s, but you've put it in there as a crisis moment between the two protagonists here. There's a scene where people are looking at TV as a report for World War II. I thought, I don't know about TV in 1945. And a couple other small examples like that. Or at another point, you mentioned somebody felt colonial guilt for what had happened to the Native Americans and the Latinos that had lived in this territory and then were sort of booted out from it. So I'm curious about how you tread that line, or you want to make it relevant and speak in vocabulary people will recognize. You don't want to be so offensive given the vocabulary of the day that nobody's going to read it, or that becomes the story. How do you find that balance of the historical and the fiction when it comes to references and historical details?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I did find that balance. I think it's kind of a doomed conceit from the beginning, trying to imagine a time you didn't live through. But I also think if you don't try, then what are we doing? Like, that's the whole point of fiction, right? Is trying to live in someone else's shoes for a while. The inclusion of the term Jap was something that I really stared at it for a long time because I knew it didn't fit, but I needed it in that kind of pivotal moment in the book. It's actually somewhat early on. I wanted it because this is a book about women in STEM. And of course, it didn't come into kind of common parlance really until Philip Roth, much later, right? But this idea that it was used mostly between Jewish communities, right? And that's really a theme in the book, is like the different Jewish communities not approving of each other, and isolating each other in a time when Jews were being persecuted across the ocean, right? And so specifically Jewish American princess was a way of kind of denigrating these, not just immigrant Jews for their kind of nouveau riche, like having money, which of course is a stereotype that, as old as time, but also specifically Jewish women, right? Like, how dare you? And so the fact that it was the same word as the slur that was being used for Japanese people that was spray painted on buildings, and this horrible, horrific story of our actual lived history that gets watered down quite a bit in high school classrooms, certainly did in mine. I really wanted that in there. And so it's fiction. I did make these allowances. And then I was telling myself historical notes just got longer and longer because I wanted to make sure if I moved a timeline for the sake of narrative design, which is something I really believe you do need to do because it should be a page turner, right? Like you don't want to be so beholden to what actually happened in what order that your reader falls asleep. But you also want to make sure that you do your due diligence to explain it to them in the aftermath. And I will say that since the book has come out, I had a really hard time letting go of it. And I have twice as long historical notes that'll be going in the paperback edition in October of like all the little things that I want to make sure everybody knows. And there are more things that you've read very closely to catch those. There are things about the actual life in Los Alamos that I want to update as well in the historical notes so that people will really know what the lived experience was because of the allowances I took.
Yeah. So I had one last question, and then I'm happy to open for comments, questions from here or from those online as well. And that is about the question of guilt, because I found guilt as one of the themes that sort of runs through the book. You've got guilt that Alice feels because she's betraying or not being as loyal to a fiance who she doesn't really love anyways, but she hasn't made a clean break with him. There's a lot of miscommunications or lack of communications between her and her fiance, but between her and Caleb and her. And he pushes her away multiple times trying to save her, but it's also causing pain. And of course, overarching all of it is the implications of the work they're doing. That once they realize what they're working on and what it's going to be used for, and then when the Germans surrender in May, and yet they're still working on it, they thought it was to stop the Germans, and now they realize it's going to go somewhere else. There is a wonderful passage about the guilt that Caleb feels, if I can make a request. It's on 246. It's the paragraph where it's after the bomb. They're beginning to sort of clear out from Los Alamos. And Caleb talks about how he hates the building that he has to go into. So it's that third paragraph.
Caleb nodded.
Yeah.
I love that I have no idea what paragraph I'm about to read. This is great. Okay, so Caleb nodded, but he hated that building. Wherever he went, whatever he did, he couldn't shake the tally in his head of the people who had died because of the science he had helped dream up. Every time he passed someone on the street, he wondered if the guilt showed on him. How many more would lose their lives because of his calculations? He had spent all his time in this secret city, racing toward the future so eagerly, thrilled to have money to send home, and thankful to avoid the violence of the army. He'd felt so lucky to spend the war years admiring the natural world and dreaming about scientific realms of possibility. He hadn't even stopped to question what world would be left waiting for him when he got out.
So I'm curious for anything that you want to share on the guilt theme or the guilt of working on the project and the fact of lack of communication. I mean, you do talk in the family or historical notes that the fact that your grandparents didn't talk about this, that maybe there was some level of guilt involved in that.
Yeah, I think in writing the book, I was really searching for my grandfather. Like I was so close to him growing up. We were just a mile away and I spent a ton of time at their house and he was just, larger than life to me. So it's very weird to then grow up and realize this person was just a person, and to have that kind of melt away. And he never spoke about how he felt. My grandmother was very vocal in her writing. And I have letters that she published and things that she wrote about how the baby that she did give birth to in Los Alamos, who's my uncle, who came to one of my readings and I had to read it in front of him. She felt that her anxiety and depression was the reason he was an ill baby and that she suffered depression for many years after. And she said that and wrote it, but then never talked to us about it. And that she said the specter of the bomb would follow her wherever she went. That was her quote. My grandfather never said anything. And so I always went, what did he think? He's the one who really did the work. And he always would kind of go, no, I was just a face in the crowd. But, if there's enough faces in the crowd, that can change the world. And finally, my uncle, in doing all these interviews, one of my uncles said, I think there's a lot in his silence, but in the fact that he stood by her while she did these readings, that she was sort of saying what he couldn't. And he even told me, and I think I may read this, that he said, he overheard him saying, I wonder if my children can forgive me for what I've done. But I also think I don't blame, or, I don't know that anyone would do anything different if you think that the world is ending and Hitler might have it first, right? Like, what do you do in those moments? And I think it's really helpful, being in a really fraught political moment right now, to look back and kind of think through, how history records what happened, right? How this will go down in history books years from now. And to think about the things we carry kind of beyond, and there's nothing more Jewish than guilt, right? The end on the,
That's true.
the idea too, which your book also has helped me with, is this idea of guilt about not being Jewish enough, not doing Jewishness right. And, my husband, who's getting our kids to bed right now, that he's someone who really hates organized religion, although he was born into a Jewish family. But I think what your book is helping me see is that there's nothing more Jewish than hating organized religion sometimes, like that's okay. That's Jewish too. And so I think like guilt is a major theme through all of it, but something that I don't think anyone else has really pinpointed yet, as an undercurrent, beyond the obvious arc structure.
Yep. I also like to point out we're not that organized. So, so then it makes it easier. Great. Well, so I'm happy to hear comments or questions. David, do you mind running the mic to people who have any questions? And I'll see if anybody online has any. You can type in the chat, or if you want to unmute, that's fine too. Anyone have any thoughts or comments or reactions? We'll make Sharon go at least second. Okay, go ahead.
So I have not read the book. I'm looking forward to doing that. I have several questions, but just overall, writing historical fiction, how do you separate the real history from the fiction? And how that must be. I've been trying to do that all my life, and I still haven't been able to do it. So that's why I write poetry instead. But that is a main question for me as a writer. How you were able to separate or sift out to make the story and to make it an engaging story. But obviously, just the theme is engaging, but I mean, to make it fiction, but based on history, maintaining the same names of people. You didn't, it sounds like all the people that are historically are part of the story are named with their true names. You didn't, change their names. And yeah, I was just wondering how, what's the trick? How do you do it?
David, do you want to bring it back? She needs the mic to answer. Well, but for the people online, they won't hear it.
That's such a great question. I don't think that I would not pretend to have the answer, right? Like that's not something that I have solved. I do think it's dangerous to think that that there is, one version of truth, right? Like this, and this is kind of the place we're in now that's really scary, is that people can see something with their own eyes, and then it goes on, TikTok and all these other social, and then it's like you're told you didn't see what you think you saw. And so I think for me, I was thinking about, there's this quote I always came back to, that nonfiction is about facts, but maybe fiction is about truth, right? Like, so by lying, you can actually get at the emotional reality in a way that if you're really, stuck, or like I was saying, I was beholden to my grandmother's notes of what the weather was like on this Tuesday. And to be able to really explore, you're going to make some mistakes, you're going to get some things wrong, but you're also going to maybe get some things right. And so I think that was where I was trying to figure it out. And it was terrifying because anyone in my family knew who every single character was based on. It was fun to have them read the book. I didn't let anyone read it until after it was out in the world. I didn't let anyone read an early draft. And then they went, oh, this is Ben, this is Zeta, this is, they went through all the lists. And I was like, yeah, that it's also more than one person represented in a different figure, and that they're all kind of washing in and out of each other in a way that felt like maybe more honest in the end.
We
if
have
that makes any
we have a
sense.
question online. I like to use the idea that stories can ring true, even if they're not actually true. Lori, were you going to ask a question?
I was just going to ask, I was just curious, whether her grandparents stayed at Los Alamos after the war. Did they continue to work there?
My grandfather, no, they left in 46 and never went back. And in fact, never even visited. My grandmother, her book, Los Alamos Experience, she never even went back to read it at the Historical Society, any of the book events, any of that. And so when I brought my book, I did my launch in Los Alamos with the archives and the Historical Society and the Los Alamos Arts Council. And it was so kind of surreal to read in that space and have her book. We read excerpts from her book and to be like, this is a homecoming sort of. But they did have it stashed away in Hans Beta's house on Bathtub Row. It was in one of the cupboards. So somebody had read it, one of the researchers that lived there, and it had been in the space. But no, they never went back.
Yeah, the reason I ask is my brother's ex-wife grew up in Los Alamos in the 40s and 50s, and her father was a pilot in the war, but he was also a physicist, and came to Los Alamos in 1945 after they did the bomb, but he supervised. So I heard a lot of stories about, they got married in Los Alamos, and I heard a lot of stories from the lab people about what it was like to grow up, including like where there were no roads that went to Los Alamos until the mid 50s, that they had to pick your car up by a crane and put it up in the mesa because they didn't want the Russians to know where they were, which they knew where they were anyway, but it was all this sort of stuff. So I just was wondering if they had been there later, because it was sort of interesting.
Yeah, one of the things that I love the most, I mean, I found all these little stories like that in researching it and going to the town. And there's a lookout point when you're driving up the hill where everyone stops to look at this beautiful, like 180-degree view of the mesa. But if you turn around and look away from the view, you can actually see the original switchback that they took up the hill. And it's like you have to look away from the beautiful thing to see it. And I thought that was really amazing. But in my launch, the woman who interviewed me was the executive director of the Historical Society. And she had worked with, what's his name, Christopher Nolan on the film when he came in to shoot in Fuller Lodge. And she said that her board didn't want her to let him in because the town of Los Alamos has this really intense kind of fear of only being known for this and wanting to be known for something else, and that he was going to make them look, Batman-ish, because that's what he's known for. And she said, but he's going to tell the story in the movie either way, so we really need to make sure that he gets it right. So she's the one who brought him in and had him tell the story and be in the space. But yeah, it's a really interesting thing that there's this sort of weight that the people who live there carry of, and then of course it's being amped up now as we were exchanging in emails of the nuclear program that's just this year, in the next 30 years, $1.7 trillion going into the nuclear program. And Los Alamos is kind of at the heart of that still.
I want to take it back to your historical notes, because I was reading them yesterday about Feynman, which I did not know about his misanthropy. Is that the word? Misogyny. And you made a comment that really got me thinking about, how do you separate a human's accomplishments versus who they are as a person? How do you separate Feynman's accomplishments as a physicist or his humor from his misogyny? How do you separate Picasso's art from his sluttiness? How do you separate Wagner from his anti-Semitism? And it's something I've thought a lot about through the years. And then you get to the guilt. How do you separate what you hope you don't peak at 25 or 28, but how do you separate what you accomplish or do as a young person that may have moral ambiguity as we progress in the world? And how do we not judge today Or how do we not judge yesterday from today's perspective?
Yeah, I think that, that term presentism, right, of like trying not to judge historical figures by today's ethics is huge. And it's even, so this is what's so hard. Like there's an author I really love at the Art Institute who does a whole class called Can You Love the Art and Hate the Artist? And I think that's where this whole idea of can you love the science but hate the scientist? And I don't know, this month we've just lost Neil Gaiman. Any of you guys are sci-fi readers, right? I loved his books. I'm so devastated. Can we read his books? Like, can we still enjoy them? I don't know. I think for me, it's not a like black or white, there's never a clear answer. It's case by case. In Neil Gaiman's case, that he was so good at writing sex scenes and now those are ruined, right? Like, I'm like, oh, but I do think the conversation around what we do is the thing that matters. Maybe not so much as like, contemporary people, if you're buying their books, you're supporting them. It's tricky. And, we shouldn't be buying them on Amazon and all that. But I do think that there's this tendency to like holier than thou, I would never, and I wanted to kind of try to get beyond that if possible by humanizing someone who did, Oppenheimer was no saint either, guys. Like, as you know, he had his affairs and, yeah, it's just an interesting thing that we like to build myths. And I think what I'm interested in is like chipping away at the myth and getting at the person behind it. And that's, heartbreaking, I think, when we make our contemporary authors and celebrities into myths and then the same thing happens in real life. And you go, oh, I have to mourn Neil Gaiman, who I never really knew.
I think I have a question.
I greatly look forward to reading your book. I've always been a fan of not only the physics involved with fission in its two different forms, whether it was in the little boy or the fat man type, but just the personalities involved, Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer, Leslie Groves, other scientists, Teller, Kistiakowsky, all those kind of people. One of the things that I was thinking about when you made the comment that guilt is a very Jewish thing, it gave me a chance to reflect upon my own review, my own work. I spent 35 years in working for a defense contractor, and the work that I did certainly was nothing compared to the Manhattan Project, but it did help our military be successful and to accomplish their missions against whatever enemy they chose to run the missions against. And of course, there was collateral damage. Do I feel guilty about it? No. Do I feel pride? Yes. And primarily because the work that I helped to do, we in the United States figured it out first. Wasn't used against us, we used it against others. So that may not be a very popular stand here, but I don't feel a whiff of guilt and only pride in terms of that which I did to serve our nation's military.
There's a comment online saying, you can keep the Neil Gaiman books you have, but don't buy any more.
I just want to respond to that because that's so beautifully said. And thank you for sharing that. Ben Peterson didn't feel guilty at all. He was so proud. He said, we saved the world, and it's interesting when my father-in-law, not Rich Feller's other father-in-law, found out the topic of the book, he was immediately kind of defensive. Like, what are you going to write? Like the bomb saved all these lives, right? And that's the whole thing, this debate of like weighing deaths against deaths, like how many Americans versus Japanese people would have died. And, but I was never really, it's interesting because I think it seems like I'm clearly on a side, right? But I'm not interested in taking a side. I'm interested in getting inside a moment and experiencing it and like looking around and trying to grapple with what it must have felt like. I mean, I loved my grandparents more than anything. And I'm very proud of the lives they lived. And I think that I saw them grappling with the guilt, and that's where a lot of this came from. But I also absolutely think it's really important to know that there are a lot of people in Los Alamos who are very proud, right? And Ben Peterson is one of those who really felt like the work they did, that they were fighting evil, and they were in a lot of ways, right? But then I also think it's important to reckon with history. And so one thing I've written about a lot is that we didn't have a sitting US president visit Hiroshima until Obama in 2016. And it just seemed like there was this like tendency to almost sweep over, certainly internment, in the way we talked about the war. And so I really just I think we need more stories just highlighting the different entry points into the conversations.
My son in his English class is actually reading a novel about the internment process in a high school class.
We were the lucky ones.
I think that's right.
It's
Yeah.
so-
Oh, no, it's When the Emperor Was a God. Maybe it's a different one. Anyways, but it's a fascinating process to see what he's learning in his high school experience versus what I learned in my high school experience 30 years ago. You know, the kind of questions we ask, the attitude toward conquering the West or colonialism or any of those other issues really has shifted quite a bit.
Yeah, and you mentioned colonialism in the question too. Like, actually, I will say I really tried to be aware of presentism, but my grandmother wrote about, she didn't use the word colonialism, but in her letters, she wrote about trampling holy sites, about the indigenous and Hispano community that got kicked out for the scientists, and about the kind of awareness that they were living on land that wasn't theirs, right? And I do think that's another storyline that I don't know people with the Oppenheimer movie. I don't know that people know that these people were kicked out of their homes, or that with the Trinity test, there were entire communities exposed to atomic radiation. The first people exposed to atomic radiation were American citizens, right? And they still haven't been compensated. There's the Atomic Radiation Exposure Act, and they've never been included in that. And so it's in the historical notes, but there's a whole movement of Trinity downwinders, and also Hispano and indigenous communities who were impacted. And, the scientists really did come and, history kind of fell away for them. And so I think it's important to talk about the untold parts of history.
I wonder if maybe you could read one last passage before we wrap up.
Should I do the author's note?
No, whatever you choose.
I think since we've talked a lot about family, so in the book, on the author's note, when you see it at the end, there's actually a photograph of one of the letters my grandmother wrote home, that she edited for her own book. And she referred to Los Alamos as Never Neverland. She also called it Shangri-La after James Hilton Lost Horizon, as this idea of it being a place that felt very far away, high up and outside of time, because they were just kind of in this cocoon during the war. And then I think later realized how much what they were doing was directly like the heart of the war, right? I wonder if my children can forgive me for what I've done. My grandfather, Leon Fisher, muttered these words in his living room late one night when he thought no one was listening. It is one of the great regrets of my life that I never asked my grandparents about their time in Los Alamos. They never spoke about the bomb, and we never brought it up. It was an unspoken rule, a guest at the dinner table, a commandment we abided by. Even after my grandmother's death, 64 years after they'd left that top secret mesa, my grandfather still rigidly avoided the topic of Los Alamos. Instead, he took me on dates to their special places and described the way she had stirred her tea, initiating the tea leaf paradox, a whirlpool that broke the rules of the spiral centrifuge. What I do know is this: my grandfather worked on the plutonium core of the Fat Man bomb, and my grandmother, Phyllis Fisher, taught elementary school to the scientist children, focusing on Longfellow and long division, afraid to ask questions. My Zeta was from an Orthodox family. He turned his back on his upbringing to pursue science. His love for physics was only ever overshadowed by his love for my grandmother, who was entirely out of his league, a socialite from a wealthy Jewish family and heiress of the famous San Francisco de Youngs. When she fell in love with him, my great-grandmother warned her away. If you marry him, you'll never have a grand piano. It seemed the only way for them to be together was to disappear. Together, they vanished into the mysterious community under J. Robert Oppenheimer that would go down in history as the Manhattan Project. During their time at Los Alamos, my Zeta never told my grandmother what he was working on behind barbed wire in the laboratory known simply as Project Y. But when she was pregnant with their second child, my grandmother pieced it together. As a joke, while debating baby names in their flat top house in McKeeville, she suggested the name uranium. When she uttered the forbidden word, my grandfather stormed out the door. Uranium Fisher had been too close to uranium fission. Years later, my grandmother published a book of her government-censored letters home entitled Los Alamos Experience, for which the above excerpt was revised and repurposed. My grandfather remained tight-lipped and never attested to feelings of guilt, yet he stood pensively by her side while she traveled to Japan to lecture about peace. I didn't mention this. They moved to Japan for 3 years. The signs that he was grappling with his role in creating the bomb were there. My grandparents lived in Tokyo for many years, and consequently, their house was strewn with Japanese relics. I always wondered whether their fixation on Japanese culture was directly connected to their feelings of remorse. The house felt haunted by the oni masks of ogres that guarded their entryway. In carefully preserved news clippings, my grandfather meticulously tracked the bomb's evolution. In articles documenting the test bombings in the Bikini Atoll in Vegas, which dubbed itself Atomic City, and in his transcript of Oppenheimer's security clearance hearing, he scribbled desperately in the margins. I pored over those notations, trying to make sense of his words. Then, in the years that followed my grandmother's death, my grandfather stopped documenting. He lost track of time. He kept forgetting my grandmother was gone. He went looking for her in the middle of the night and wandered aimlessly around his block. He left music on for all hours of the day to fend off the silence. He claimed it was to deter burglars, but I knew better. When he died and was buried beside her, I placed stones on his grave, a Jewish tradition. In that moment, I recalled the eerie green stone in his study that looked like it was from outer space. On the plane ride home, with a suitcase full of their Japanese keepsakes, I wrote down my questions. Later, I tracked down his still living friends who have since passed away to ask them my questions and listen to their stories. Over flickering Shabbat candles, Murray Peshkin, one of my grandfather's colleagues in the experimental physics division, describes seeing a fellow SED's hand blown off by dynamite. Ben Peterson, a self-proclaimed communist and associate who had worked beside my grandfather, spoke about bunking next to David Greenglass, who later turned in his own sister, Ethel Rosenberg, for espionage. When I pressed for more, Peterson avoided the subject. That was 70 years ago, he said. It's amazing how memory fades. I knew he was lying. Using a cigarette, he had famously burned a hole through his diary on August 6, 1945, the day the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Secrets are secrets, he said, meeting my eyes. He let me hold the damaged book, and I stared at the hole in the words. This novel is my attempt to stitch it back together. Thank you so
very
much.